Good morning. As Maddie just said, my name is Luke, and I'm an associate pastor here. I'm normally hiding behind the safety of my guitar, but I'm super excited to get the opportunity to share a word that I believe God has laid on my heart. To start, I want to share a little bit about myself, particularly my junior year of college. At the beginning of the year, I had the opportunity to propose to my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife of 3 years. And at the beginning of that year, it started with the wedding planning and the marriage counseling. And on top of that, with junior year of college, I also got to start taking some of the classes at which I wanted to go to college for, get some of the gen eds out of the way. And as some of you know who have been to college, junior year is typically when you realize that your freshman and sophomore classes weren't as bad as you thought that they were. And so as the workload began to pile on, I also got a couple more opportunities. I got to start leading worship at a church just outside of town just about every single week. And I was also a chapel worship leader, which was twice a week, doing that with practices in between. And then whenever I wasn't leading for that, I was often on the band as well. And I was also given the opportunity to be something called a spiritual life director, which was a role in which it was organizing students and a monthly service projects and making sure people showed up and make sure that we had a project to go serve at, and as well as overseeing a weekly service called Altar that was all students speaking and music. It was a full service and organizing and making sure that that was happening when we didn't have people filling in the cracks here and there. And I was also waiting tables and serving and trying to make a little money on the slide to help pay for the wedding and for life and future apartment. Do any of you have the sickness of saying yes? And I use the word sickness on purpose, because that is what I had my junior year. If it felt like I was just running on, droning on, it's because I was. I had all these opportunities, and they're all good things, but I just kind of kept saying yes. Yeah, that's a great opportunity. I'd love to do that. Yeah, I also want to do that over here. Let's do that over here. And my schedule just piled and piled and piled. And just as the year continued on, I was just being worn down and began to get tired and was starting to look at the end of the year just kind of begging for finals to be over, begging for my role as spiritual life director to be kind of done, kind of be able to throw in the towel. Just kind of begging for it to stop. Has anyone here ever felt like that before? Just as you say yes and say yes and say yes, and our schedules fill and they fill and they fill. They can be great things, but we just run out of room for anything else. And ironically, as I was studying to be a pastor and was spiritual life director and a worship leader, I had removed all the space for God to work through those things. I didn't leave any room for Him, and that year it just felt like I was just drying up. I feel like that's often the case for many of us. When we ask, hey, how are you doing? What is one of the most common answers that we get? I am good, but busy. I'm good, but busy. In our society, many wear this like a badge of honor. Like I did my junior year, I got all these opportunities. I was the person who's picked to do these things, so I want to say yes. So I want people to know how special I am, that I got asked to do all these things, so it can't go to someone else. So I have to say yes to everything. And we live in a society that often praises this. In the 1960s, there's a job called being a futurist, which is someone whose job is literally to study the future. And they tell the government, this is what society is going to look like this many years from now. They look at the devices that are being made, and they look at different inventions, and they say, this is the impact that it is going to have on our society going forward. And in 1967, there was a government-funded subcommittee that came to the conclusion, they said by 1985, with all of these time-saving devices, the average work week for the American will be 22 hours and will continue to descend from there. I don't know about your work week, but mine is not 22 hours. I think that they were just a little bit off. We live in a culture where people run from one thing to the next. We fill our schedules till they are bursting at the seams. And coming out of our previous series, Knockoffs, in which we looked at these things like peace, love, and joy, these things that as Christians are supposed to be our default settings. That when we launch into the day, we start with a peace and a joy and a love for those around us. And yet, I know for myself and many I talk to, it's not our default settings. Our default setting is running around, begging to get a breath of fresh air as we become weary. So the question is, what do we do about this? We are weary when we're tired, when peace, love, and joy aren't our default settings. I believe Jesus answers this question in Matthew 11, 28 through 30. If you have your devices or a phone, you're more than welcome to pull those up, but it'll also be on the screen. In this passage, Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." This is one of those passages growing up. I grew up in the church. My dad was a pastor, and my grandpa was a pastor, and all my grandparents always went to church and were super involved. This is one of those passages that was like everywhere all the time. Just constantly hearing it, like it's the kind that like your grandma would cross stitch, like have one of these in her bathroom. I was just always around this passage. And it was one of those things I was like, I should know what it means because I've heard it so many times, like understanding by quantity. And yet, this is a passage that God's been bringing back to my heart and bringing back up. And as I'm spending time meditating on this passage, I've begun to realize I didn't understand it quite as well as I thought that I did. And as I've meditated on this and reread through it, I've come to the conclusion that this passage is really weird. It's super strange. And to get to the weirdness of this, you have to understand, what is a yoke? This is what a yoke is, that giant piece of wood connecting two oxen. And I don't know about you, but when I'm weary and when I am tired, I don't think of farm work as being like I need some good old manual labor as a good pick-me-up. This giant piece of wood connects these two oxen to a giant metal blade in which the ox then pull through the dirt. Tough manual labor. And so what is Jesus saying? This is so counterintuitive. It seems so backwards. What this is an invitation. This passage is an invitation to a different way of living. His invitation is for us to put on this yoke, for us to strap ourselves to Jesus and to follow his lead, to learn how he did life. He's saying if you're tired of the way that you are doing life, if it seems like you're exhausted the way that you approach things, let me show you a better way to learn to shoulder the weight of life with ease. Jesus understood the reality that life is not always easy. He understood it deeply as the way his own life went and ended. And this is one of the things that's so profound about Jesus and his message. Is that there are so many messiahs and false messiahs that have come before and have come after and will continue to come, that come bearing these messages that say, if you accept this, all of your problems are just going to go away. Money will start showing up in your account if you're short. All of your relationship issues are just going to poof if you accept this message. Or another very popular one is you don't have to worry about anything now because later everything's going to be great, so just accept this message and just don't worry about anything until later because none of this matters anymore. And unlike those messiahs, Jesus was not delusional. He understood that life comes with trials. So his solution isn't a vacation. It's not a self-help book or an escape. It's equipment. It's a tool to step out of our burnout society into a life of soul rest. It's equipment to connect us to Jesus and learn how to do life as he did. So that leads to the obvious question of, how did Jesus do life? What is this life that he's inviting us into? And I believe that there are two overarching principles that decided how Jesus was going to make every single decision. These two priorities bled into everything that he did. And the first is that he worked to make space for God. And again, I use the term work intentionally. It's difficult. It doesn't just happen on accident. When Jesus started his ministry, he started it with 40 days fasting and praying in the desert. This is a man who is carrying the greatest news to ever reach mankind. And his starting approach wasn't, I have to run out and start as soon as possible. His approach was, I'm going to fast, I'm going to pray, I'm going to be connected with God. And Scripture is packed time and time again as you read through the Gospels over and over and over as Jesus is going through his ministry. And he went away to pray. And he retreated to the mountain to pray. 29 times through the Gospels, the writer found it significant enough to make note. 29 times. These passages, these verses are following verses that are like Jesus spitting on someone's eyes and them being able to see. Him multiplying fish and loaves. I don't know about you, but if I was the writer, I feel like I may have added a few more, use that space to add a few more details on him, turning water into wine, or those things. But Jesus' emphasis on prayer had to be overwhelming for the writers to see it. This was so important. It was so crucial to who he was. He was always constantly with the Father and making space to be with him. So the reality is we are never going to be filled with the gifts of God if we are never with him. If we never spend time with him, how do we expect to be filled by him? So the reality is God desires relationship. And that's why he saved us in the way that he did. When we rebelled at the beginning of mankind, God didn't come down as a tyrant and overthrow the government and demand our allegiance. He came as a vulnerable baby. A baby who had to be protected, who had to run away to stay safe, so that he could relate with us, so that he could know us. It's a relationship. So as I said earlier, my wife, who I've been married to for now 3.5 years, imagine if she came to me and just said, hey, I don't feel like we're connecting enough lately. Could we just start spending 30 minutes a day just connecting, talking, putting everything away, and maybe one night a week of a date night just to connect and get to know each other? My response was no. No, I'm too busy. I don't have time to hang out, hear about your day. It's going to happen. Our relationship is going to erode. It's going to fall away. We're going to begin to know each other less and less. It's the same with friendships. I know for myself, this is the case with many of my high school relationships. My friends I was super close to, that we hung out every single day, would go to each other's houses, and were with each other constantly, and through those years knew each other so intimately and knew all the details of each other's lives. And now when I come across their paths and we talk and we catch up, as time continues to pass, we don't hardly know who each other are anymore. We don't know about the details in and out of our days that make up who we are. So why would we see our relationship with Jesus as any different? If we're not with him, we can't be like him. Which often with this comes the question of, as we began this, of the busyness of all these things that we often say yes to and cram our schedules full. There's a question of, is a solution than just to add more stuff and cram more in our schedule. But you're in grad school, have a demanding job, the reality of little kids. You're not an introvert and don't like sitting down and being quiet for more than 2 minutes. One of the tools that I used that greatly helped me through my junior year and that chaos, and something I still use to this day when I am beginning to feel overwhelmed and feel like I don't have any space, is literally set a schedule every hour and remind yourself and write down how you have spent that past hour. Write down the details, in excruciating detail. And I found often for myself that there's often a lot more time than I would like to admit that, just kind of like flutters away into little things of picking up the phone, checking up here, watching something, getting distracted here and there. There's often time that just slips away if we're not careful. And the honest truth is that most of us have more than enough time to work with. And we just need to reallocate our time to seeking the kingdom of God instead of the kingdom of entertainment. But the reality is, for some, life is legitimately too busy to set any time. And for you, I would just encourage you to make sure that it's a season and not a way of approaching life. To find a way going forward, to get creative on making space for God. So we will never be like him if we are never with him. And the second principle that bled into everything that Jesus did was he worked to make space for people. Looking at the 4 Gospels, Jesus was rarely in a hurry, rushing around. Can you imagine him saying, when someone comes up and says, hey, I need my leg healed, I need your touch, if he were to say, nah, I'm too busy, I got this big TED Talk in Jerusalem, got a plane to catch, got to get out of here. But here is my disciple Thaddeus. You've never heard of him, but he will gladly pray with you. I got to go. See ya. It doesn't happen. He's always present. He somehow has time. He was fiercely present. He had things going on constantly. He had places to be. He was carrying, again, the most important message ever, and places to be. And yet, he lived his life in a way where he made time. And pretty much his whole ministry was him being interrupted one time after another. He wasn't just sitting around with nothing to do. He was busy, but he prioritized people. He put on display an unhurried life where space for God and to love people were at the top of his priorities. Prayer in the mornings, the regular retreats with him and God, and many long meals with friends. Ultimately, the yoke that Jesus calls us to carry is to love God and love others. And love isn't something that you can do in passing. One of the most famous verses is this, when Jesus is asked, what is the most important command? And Jesus responds, love God and love others. He pretty much says you can throw pretty much everything else out. It boils down to this. And love, again, is not something that you can do in passing. It's something that takes time. When I was in high school, I ran cross country, where my friends my freshman year convinced me to join against my wishes. And as I began showing up to practices and started running, I came to the conclusion really quickly that running is awful and I don't like it. However, seeing those varsity runners who could just glide and just seem like run forever, just obscenely fast, I remember being fascinated with it. I started to want it as I got through the season, and I started getting a little bit better shape, and it started becoming a little bit more fun as I was shaving time off of every single race and was PRing. And I began to desire to run like that, to be fast. And as the season of my freshman year came to a close, the coach handed us all a sheet to record our summer workouts with suggested workout routines along with them so that we would come into the next season ready and in shape. And as summer passed and continued on, coming back our sophomore year, I remember seeing all the varsity runners' sheets, turning in hundreds of miles. The discipline that they had day in and day out, running, making space. And I turned in my sheet with all 3 miles that I had run in 2 separate runs, in which one was 2 miles, and then the other one was supposed to be a 3-mile run that I got a half a mile out and decided I didn't want to do it anymore. And I followed this process year after year. I would finish the season being in good shape, wanting to make a run for varsity, wanting to get in good shape. But as soon as the season was over, I would turn in my sheet year after year with 10 or less miles in my off season. To get in shape is a lifestyle. It's a way of approaching things. Those runners had to eat right, had to be disciplined, had to choose day after day when it was hard, when their schedules filled up with other things, to prioritize getting in those miles so that they could compete and make a run for state. It's a lifestyle. And it's the same in our relationship with God and what Jesus calls us to. And the yoke that he calls us to carry is a lifestyle. Again, we've just finished our series talking about the greatest gifts that God offers us: peace and love and joy. And our call is to follow him and to pursue those things. There's also the very real reality that Jesus wasn't a mother. He wasn't a father. He wasn't a college student or in our current workforce and the chaos and the busyness that our culture craves. But our question day in and day out has to be, how would Jesus do this? How would he approach this? And I think a common answer that Jesus would give is to slow down. It's to make space. The greatest commandment that God has given us is to love others and love God, and those things take time. And they can't be done quickly. This isn't a guilt trip. This is an invitation. This is the invitation that Jesus is extending to us. An invitation to a life that we ache for. An invitation to a life of rest. A life that can only be found by going shoulder to shoulder with Jesus. So ultimately, this comes to a crossroads and a decision. Are we willing to make space and to create a schedule in which God has space to work? To make room for love and joy and peace to become our default settings? Are we ready to arrange or rearrange our days so that Jesus is our new normal? One of my favorite quotes of all time is from a man I believe is one of the wisest to ever live. His name is Dallas Willard. And during an interview, the interviewer asked him the question, what do I have to do to become like Jesus? And his response was, you must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. And after writing that down, the interviewer asked him, okay, that's awesome, but what else? What else do I have to do? His response was, that's it. Ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. God works in the space, in the margins. Do you have space to love God? Do you have space to love those who are around you? Do you have time for those who come across your path? So for some of you, you may know whatever it is, that step that you may need to take to love God or love those around you better. Maybe inviting your neighbor over for a dinner that you've been meaning to get to know, or a coworker. Or set a time, more space, just to be with God, to meditate. For others of you, if you're in a place of saying, that sounds great, I would love for joy and peace and love to be overflowing for me. I would love to make space for God, but I don't even know where to start. We started something not too long ago that Ben mentioned earlier called Foundations. These are relationships and which are meant to equip you to know how to structure your days, structure your life so that God has space to work, so that God has space to pour into you. I encourage you, if this is something that you're interested in, you can write on your Connect card and we'll reach out to you this week. Do you have space to love God and to love those who He has put in your path? As we continue the service, the worship team is going to play, and they're going to give a little bit of space at the beginning. They're not going to start singing right away. It'll just be a couple of minutes that we just encourage you just to take a breath. Be with God, be present. Through the chaos of the Christmas season, I encourage you just to take this time to speak with God and to hear from Him. Let's close in prayer.